If I could go back to November 12th, I would have taken the lighter from my pocket and burned the lease agreement right on the property manager's desk. I would have walked out into the freezing rain and slept in my Honda Civic for another month, but I didn't. I was 23, flat broke, and desperate enough to ignore the way the air in apartment 304 felt heavy, like walking into a room where an argument just ended. The rent was $625 a month. In a city where a closet-sized studio usually goes for double that, it was a miracle. Or, more accurately, a trap. The building was a crumbling 1,920 seconds brick monstrosity called the Galloway Arms. It smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and old copper pipes. Mr. Kovac, the superintendent, was a greasy man with trembling hands who wouldn't look me in the eye when he handed over the keys. "One rule," he mumbled, staring at his boots. "Don't mess with the north wall. The insulation is precarious. Old building. Asbestos, maybe. Just leave it be." I should have listened. I spent the first 3 days unpacking my meager life. A mattress on the floor, a folding table for my laptop, and 2 boxes of clothes. The apartment was decent, except for that wall. The north wall dominated the room. It was covered in a hideous, peeling floral wallpaper, faded yellow sunflowers that looked more like rotting eyes. But it wasn't just the pattern that unnerved me. It was the texture. The wall wasn't flat. It bowed outward into the room, bloated and uneven. When I pushed my thumb against it, the surface didn't feel like plaster or brick. It felt soft, spongy. There was so much paper layered on there that it gave slightly under pressure, like bruising fruit. It absorbed sound too. If I tapped on the drywall on the south side, it sounded hollow. But if I knocked on the north wall, nothing. Just a dull, wet thud that died instantly, as if the wall had swallowed the noise. By Friday night, the silence of the apartment started getting to me. I sat at my folding table, the blue light of my laptop screen casting long distorted shadows against the floral patterns. I was trying to work, but my eyes kept drifting to a seam in the paper right near the baseboard. It was peeling slightly. Just a tiny, dog-eared corner of yellow paper fluttering in the draft from the window. It taunted me. It was imperfect, it was annoying, and despite Mr. Kovac's warning, or maybe because of it, I felt a sudden, childish urge to fix it. Just a little pull to smooth it out. I told myself I was just going to glue it back down, but as I stared at it, a cold knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. The room felt suddenly colder, the temperature dropping enough to prickle the skin on my arms. I didn't know it yet, but the building was holding its breath. It was 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, when the boredom finally won out. I had been staring at a blank Word document for 3 hours, listening to the radiator clank and hiss like a dying animal. My eyes kept snapping back to that loose corner near the floorboards. It was flapping rhythmically, a tiny yellow flag surrendering to the draft. I rolled my office chair backward, the plastic wheels grinding against the warped hardwood floor. "Screw it," I whispered. I sat on the floor, my legs crossed, and reached for the loose edge. The paper felt strangely damp, clammy against my fingertips. I gripped the corner and pulled. I expected it to be brittle. I expected it to flake off in dry, dusty chips like normal old wallpaper. Instead, it held together with sickening resilience. The sound it made was visceral, a slow, thick chirrip that vibrated through my hand, reminding me uncomfortably of separating raw chicken breasts. A strip about 6 inches long curled away, revealing the layer beneath. The second layer was arguably worse than the first. It was a geometric nightmare of maroon and gray triangles, the kind of design you'd see in a cheap dentist's waiting room in 1994. But I didn't care about the aesthetics. I stared at the spot where the yellow sunflowers had been covering the geometric shapes. Right there, written in thick, black permanent marker, were 2 words: "Help me." The letters were jagged, written with aggressive force. The H trailed off into a sharp downward slash, like the writer had been yanked away mid-stroke. I froze for a second, my heart doing a silly little stutter in my chest. Then, I let out a sharp breath, and actually laughed. The sound was thin and pathetic in the empty room. "Okay," I muttered, tossing the strip of sunflower paper into the trash can. "Very funny. It had to be a prank." Of course it was. The previous tenant probably got evicted or moved out in a hurry and decided to screw with the next guy. It was the oldest trick in the book: leave a creepy message behind the wallpaper or under the floorboards to freak out the new arrival. I'd seen Reddit threads about exactly this kind of thing. I ran my thumb over the writing. The black ink was shiny, sitting on top of the maroon triangles. It looked old though. The edges of the marker strokes were slightly feathered, bleeding into the cheap paper fibers. I stood up, brushing the dust off my sweatpants. I felt a little foolish for that initial spike of adrenaline. It was just a joke. A stupid, edgy joke left by some college kid who probably thought they were the next Stephen King. I went back to my computer and tried to work, but the room felt different now. The air felt stiller. And even though I told myself it was nonsense, I couldn't help but notice that the help me was positioned perfectly at eye level if you were sitting on the floor or crouching in fear. I lasted exactly 14 hours before I was back at the wall. It was Wednesday afternoon. The gray light of a typical November overcast was filtering through the dirty window, making the apartment look even more dismal. I had tried to ignore the help me written on the maroon triangles, but every time I looked away, I could feel it burning a hole in my peripheral vision. It was like an itch inside my skull that I couldn't scratch. I told myself I was just cleaning up, that I was doing the landlord a favor by getting rid of this architectural monstrosity. I grabbed a metal spatula from my kitchen drawer. I didn't have a proper scraper, and jammed the corner under the maroon geometric paper. It was stuck fast, fused to the layer beneath it by decades of adhesive and humidity. I had to use 2 hands, putting my weight into it, gouging the wall. Rip. Tear. Crunch. The sound was louder today, more violent. I tore away a sheet about the size of a movie poster. The air instantly filled with a fine, chalky dust that tasted like vinegar. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face, and peered at what I had exposed. Beneath the 90 seconds, maroon triangles was a layer of pale, sickly pastel stripes, definitely 1,980 seconds. And there, centered perfectly in the patch I'd cleared, was writing. Not in black marker this time. It was blue ballpoint pen. The tip had been pressed so hard into the paper that it had torn through the loops of the letters. Help me. My stomach dropped. Okay, so maybe 2 tenants played a joke, a running gag? A running gag? My hands started moving faster, driven by a manic sort of curiosity that overrode my common sense. I scraped at the pastel stripes, shredding them to reveal layer 4. Layer 4 was a textured, fuzzy flocking in a nauseating shade of avocado green. 1,970 seconds. Help me. This one was written in graphite pencil, barely visible against the dark green, but the letters were large, shaky, and desperate. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I was sweating now, a cold, clammy sheen on my forehead. I dug the spatula in again, chunks of paper flying onto the floor like confetti from hell. Layer 5. A heavy, vinyl paper with a metallic gold trellis pattern. Late 60 seconds? Help me. Written in red wax crayon. I scrambled backward, crab walking across the floor until my back hit the foot of my mattress. I sat there, chest heaving, staring at the patch of excavated history on my wall. It looked like a wound. 5 layers. 4 different decades. 4 different handwriting styles. 4 different mediums. The rational part of my brain, the part that kept me sane during finals week, was misfiring. A prank required coordination. It required planning. This looked like an archive. It looked like every single person who had lived in this room for the last 40 years had spent their final moments staring at that wall, terrified, leaving the same 2 words for the next poor bastard who moved in. I looked down at the pile of scrapings on the floor. In the silence of the room, I swear I heard the paper settle, a soft rustle that sounded too much like a sigh. I didn't strip any more paper that night. I didn't even sleep in the apartment. I grabbed my backpack and crashed at a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away, nursing a single cup of coffee until the sun came up. But financial reality is a cruel tether. I couldn't afford a hotel, and I definitely couldn't afford to break my lease 3 days in. So, Thursday morning, I walked back into apartment 304. That was when the smell hit me. It wasn't there when I left. Or maybe it had been too faint to notice over the dust. But now, with the windows closed and the radiator hissing, the heat had baked it into the air. I stopped in the doorway, my hand hovering over the light switch. You know the smell of a damp basement? That musky, earthy scent of mildew? This wasn't that. It was sweet. Sickeningly sweet. It reminded me of a bag of peaches I'd once forgotten in the trunk of my car in July. Fermented, sugary rot that coated the back of your throat. But underneath the sweetness, there was a sharp, biting metallic tang, like sucking on a fistful of dirty pennies, or the taste of a nosebleed that drains down the back of your throat. I gagged, covering my nose with the collar of my flannel shirt. The source was obvious. I walked toward the north wall, stepping over the pile of confetti I'd left on the floor. The closer I got to the exposed patch, that jagged wound revealing 5 decades of terror, the stronger the stench became. It wasn't drifting from the wall. It felt like the wall was exhaling it. I stood about 2 feet away, squinting at the gold metallic trellis pattern of the 1960 seconds layer. I extended my hand, palm out, intending to touch the writing to see if the crayon was waxy or flat. I stopped inches from the surface. The air right in front of the wall was freezing. The rest of the apartment was a stifling 74 degrees thanks to the broken thermostat, but here, it felt like standing in front of an open freezer door. The cold wasn't a draft. There was no wind. It was a stagnant, heavy chill that seemed to cling to the paper layers. I shivered, the hair on my arms standing up. It felt like the wall was sucking the heat out of my body, feeding on it. "What is this place?" I whispered. I leaned in closer, my nose wrinkling at the copper rot stench. I noticed something else then. The edges of the paper I had ripped yesterday, the maroon triangles, the pastel stripes, they weren't crisp anymore. They were curling inward, darkening at the tips. They looked damp. I reached out and touched the exposed section of the 1960 seconds layer, right next to the red helping me. It felt greasy, not wet like water, but slick. An oily residue came away on my fingertip. I rubbed my thumb and finger together, feeling the viscosity. It was clear, odorless on its own, but it made my skin crawl. I wiped my hand frantically on my jeans, a sudden wave of nausea rolling over me. The logic center of my brain was trying to scream plumbing leak or a dead rat in the wall cavity, but my instincts, the primate part of my brain that fears the dark, was screaming something else entirely. Get out. Instead, I turned around and grabbed my keys. I needed to talk to Kovac. I found Mr. Kovac in the basement, a windowless concrete dungeon that housed the building's ancient boiler. The air down there was thick and humid, smelling of burning dust and sulfur. It was a sharp contrast to the unnatural chill in my room, but somehow, it felt just as oppressive. Kovac was sitting at a rusted metal desk in the corner, nursing a mug of something that smelled like diesel fuel. When the heavy fire door slammed shut behind me, he jumped so hard he nearly knocked his mug over. "Mr. Kovac," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk about apartment 304. He didn't look up. He was a small man, shrinking inside a gray jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. He busied himself with a stack of invoices, his fingers trembling slightly. "Rent's due on the first, kid. No exceptions." "It's not about the rent," I said, stepping closer. The fluorescent light above us buzzed like a trapped insect. "It's about the wallpaper, the north wall." Kovac froze. His hand stopped midway to turning a page. The silence in the basement was sudden and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thump hiss of the boiler. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "I told you not to touch it." I peeled some back. I pressed on. There's writing underneath. Mr. Kovac. Multiple layers. People writing, "Help me," over and over again. He finally looked at me then. His face was pale, glistening with a sheen of oily sweat that had nothing to do with the heat of the boiler room. His eyes were wide, rimmed with red, and they darted over my shoulder as if checking the shadows behind me. "Graffiti," he spat out, but the word lacked conviction. Just vandalism, previous tenants, bad kids. "From the 1960 seconds? I asked, my voice rising. "I found crayon on wallpaper that hasn't been sold in 50 years. And there's a smell, a rotting smell coming from the wall." Kovac stood up so abruptly, his chair screeched across the concrete. He walked around the desk, not toward me, but toward the tool rack, putting distance between us. He wouldn't meet my eyes anymore. He stared aggressively at a row of wrenches. "Listen to me," he said, and I heard the fear in his voice. It was raw, shaking his vocal cords. "You want your deposit back? You stop destroying the unit." "Mr. Kovac, what is in that wall?" "Nothing," he shouted, spinning around. He looked cornered. "It's just an old building. It settles. It stinks. You don't like it? Leave. Break the lease and get out." He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "But if you stay, you leave that wall alone. You hear me? You buy a bucket of primer, and you paint over whatever you found. Seal it up. Why? I asked, softer this time. Why seal it up? He leaned in close, and for a second, I saw genuine pity in his watery eyes. He lowered his voice to a whisper, as if the pipes themselves were listening. Because you don't want to see what's under the next layer. Just paint over it. Don't peel it, please. He turned his back on me and started aggressively tightening a valve that wasn't loose. The conversation was over. I walked back upstairs, the metal stairs clanging under my feet. I had gone down there looking for answers, for a rational explanation. Instead, I left with the sinking realization that my landlord wasn't just negligent, he was an accomplice. Kovac's fear should have been a bucket of ice water on my curiosity. It should have sent me running to Home Depot for that primer he mentioned. But as I stood in the center of my apartment, staring at that bulging infected patch on the north wall, his words didn't feel like a warning. They felt like a challenge. Don't peel it. I couldn't help it. It was a compulsion now, a physical itch under my skin that wouldn't stop until I saw what was underneath. I didn't buy primer. I bought a heavy-duty scraper and a box of contractor bags. By Friday night, I was in a trance. The floor was covered in a knee-deep drift of curled, rotting paper. The air was thick with that sweet copper blood smell, so potent now that I had to tie a t-shirt around my face, just to breathe without gagging. Layer 8, blue sailboats, 1,950 seconds. Help me. Layer 12, beige floral lattice, 1,940 seconds. Help me, please. Layer 15, deep crimson velvet, 1,930 seconds. God help me. I was moving like a machine, sweat dripping into my eyes, my hands cramping around the handle of the scraper. I wasn't even reading the dates on the newspapers stuck between the layers anymore. I was digging, excavating. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I hit layer 20. The paper here was different. It wasn't the mass-produced stuff from the later decades. It was thick, fibrous, and stained a deep tobacco brown. It felt like skin. When I peeled a large strip away near the center of the wall, the sound wasn't a tear. It was a wet schlock, like pulling a boot out of mud. I shone my flashlight on the exposed patch. The beam trembled in my shaking hand. The handwriting had changed. Gone were the relatively neat, desperate scrawls of the upper layers. This writing was feral. It looked like it had been carved into the paper with a nail or a knife, tearing the fibers deep enough to scar the layer beneath. The letters were jagged, overlapping, screaming in silence. And the message was no longer a plea. It was a warning. It can hear you. The words were scratched diagonally across a 3-foot section. Below that, in smaller, frantically bunched letters, don't let it breathe. Don't let it breathe. Don't let it breathe. I took a step back, my heel catching on a pile of debris. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm that felt too loud in the silent room. It can hear you. I froze. I stopped breathing. I stood perfectly still, the scraper heavy in my hand, and I listened. At first, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the blood rushing in my ears. But then, very faintly, coming from deep within the wall from behind layer 20 and whatever lay beneath it, I heard a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic expansion and contraction. A slow, wet intake of air. The wall wasn't just settling, it was inhaling. I didn't plan to sleep. I planned to sit in my chair with my back to the kitchenette, clutching the scraper like a weapon, watching the wall until sunrise. But exhaustion is a biological imperative, and the adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow. I must have passed out around 4 a.m., my head resting on my arms at the folding table. I woke up to a sound that made my teeth ache. The room was pitch black, save for the sickly orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the grime of the window. I blinked, my neck stiff, trying to orient myself. The silence of the building was profound, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet you get before a thunderstorm. Then, I heard it again. Skalo-wuk. It was a wet, sucking sound, followed by a slow, deliberate rip. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. My eyes darted to the pile of debris on the floor, thinking maybe a rat was nesting in the trash. But the sound wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from the wall. I sat perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat, listening. Scritch. Scritch. T-E-A-R. It sounded exactly like what I had been doing for the last 2 days. It was the sound of a metal tool digging under a layer of paper and peeling it back. But there was a difference. When I did it, the sound was dry, crisp paper snapping, plaster dust falling. This sound was moist. It sounded like someone peeling a sticker off a piece of raw meat. It was sodden and heavy. I slowly, agonizingly turned my head toward the north wall. The shadows played tricks on me, making the exposed patch of layer 20 look like a gaping mouth. Shki. Schluck. A strip of paper fell. I didn't see it fall into the room. I heard it fall inside the wall. That was the moment my blood turned to ice. The sound wasn't coming from the surface. It wasn't my neighbor in the next apartment. This was an exterior wall. There was nothing on the other side but 40 feet of empty air and a brick alleyway. Something was inside the wall. And it was peeling the layers too. It was working its way out. Or maybe it was working its way in. Mirroring my movements, trying to meet me in the middle. "Hello?" I whispered. The word escaped my lips before I could stop it, a pathetic, trembling sound. The tearing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was an attentive silence, a listening silence. I could feel the pressure in the room shift, focusing entirely on me. Then, from right behind the section I had cleared, directly behind the warning, "Don't let it breathe," came a soft, wet tap. Thump. It was the sound of a palm pressing against the other side of the drywall. Thump. Closer now. I grabbed my phone and scrambled backward, knocking my chair over. The crash echoed like a gunshot. I didn't wait to see if it moved. I backed into the bathroom and locked the door, sliding down to the cold tile floor, shaking so hard I couldn't unlock my screen. I sat there until dawn, listening to the silence, praying that the door handle wouldn't turn. The sun didn't rise so much, as the darkness just grayed out. I had passed out on the bath mat around 6 a.m., exhaustion finally claiming me despite the terror. When I woke up, it was 10:15 a.m. My neck was stiff, and my mouth tasted like old pennies. That metallic tang from the wall was in my throat now. I stood up, gripping the sink to steady myself. The face looking back at me in the mirror was pale, with dark bruises of fatigue under the eyes. I turned on the tap, splashing cold water on my face, trying to scrub away the feeling of the night before. That's when I saw my hands. I froze, the water running cold over my wrists. My hands were covered in a fine gray powder. It was chalky and thick, coating my palms and weaving into the creases of my knuckles. It looked like ash. "No," I whispered. "No, I was in here. I was locked in here." I brought my hands closer to my face, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just dust. Underneath my fingernails, impacted deep into the nail beds, were tiny, colorful flakes. A fleck of maroon triangle, a sliver of avocado green flocking, a smear of that waxy red crayon. I grabbed the nail brush and started scrubbing, panic rising in my throat like bile. I scrubbed until my skin was raw and red, until the water swirling down the drain turned a murky gray. I had been locked in the bathroom. I knew I had. I remembered sitting against the door. I remembered the cold tile, but the evidence was under my skin. Had I sleepwalked? Had I unlocked the door in a trance, gone out there and clawed at that cursed wall? Or, and this thought made my knees weak, had the wall reached in? Had that presence, that wet, tearing thing, come through the door that wasn't a barrier to it and touched me? I dried my hands on a towel, trembling. The skin felt tight, burned. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out into the main room. The apartment felt different, smaller. The air was so thick with humidity, it felt like walking into a greenhouse. The smell of rotting fruit and copper was overpowering now, but it was the weight of the room that stopped me. You know that feeling when you're in a crowded room and you can feel people standing behind you? The pressure of bodies? The apartment was empty, but it felt crowded. My eyes snapped to the north wall. It looked the same as I'd left it, a jagged, ugly scar of exposed history. But the debris on the floor had shifted. The piles of torn paper weren't scattered anymore. They were pushed into a semicircle, radiating out from the wall like a fan, or an altar. I walked toward it, not because I wanted to, but because my legs were moving on their own. The compulsion was back, stronger than the fear. My fingertips throbbed where the paper had been stuck under my nails. It was like a magnet. The wall wanted me to finish. It had marked me, and as I picked up the scraper, Shaking the gray dust from the handle, I realized with a sick clarity, I wasn't just uncovering something, I was setting it free. I lost the concept of time somewhere between layer 25 and layer 30. The sun moved across the floor, casting long, shifting shadows. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I was an archaeologist of pain, digging through a strata of suffering that shouldn't exist. The paper changed as I went deeper. The vinyls and heavy wallpapers of the mid-century gave way to something far more fragile. By the time I hit the layers from the 1,930 seconds and 20 seconds, the paper was brittle. It didn't peel in strips anymore. It crumbled. It flaked away like dead skin, turning into a fine choking powder that coated my eyelashes and filled my lungs. I had to use the corner of the scraper to chip it away, inch by agonizing inch. Layer 32 was backed with old newspapers. Insulation, maybe? Or just a cheap way to level the wall. I paused, wiping sweat and grime from my eyes, to read a fragment of yellowed newsprint clinging to the plaster. Stock market crash. October 29, 192. A headline from nearly 100 years ago, and right across the text, obscuring the tragedy of the Great Depression, was a tragedy much closer to home. There was no ink here, no pencil, no crayon. The message "Help me" wasn't written. It was gouged. Whatever poor soul had lived here in 1929 hadn't used a tool. They had used their fingernails. The paper was shredded, torn in jagged vertical furrows that ripped through the newsprint and into the layer beneath. I could see dark, rusty stains in the grooves. Dried blood. Ancient, oxidized blood mixed with the glue. I felt a wave of dizziness, but my hand kept moving, chipping away at the history. Layer 33. Help. Gouged. Layer 34. No, no, no. Scratched so deep the odds were just holes. When I reached layer 35, the atmosphere in the room shifted from heavy to crushing. My ears popped, like the pressure had suddenly dropped. The paper at layer 35 was a delicate, hand-painted floral design, something that might have been beautiful once. Now, it was gray with rot. The message here was different. It wasn't a single plea. It was a frantic, continuous scratch that covered the entire exposed patch. It looked like the frantic clawing of an animal trapped in a box. Let me out, let me out, let me out, let me out. The scratches were deep. They tore through layer 35, through 36, and disappeared into the dark, damp mass of layer 37. I touched the grooves. They were widely spaced, too wide for human fingers. My stomach churned. The timeline was wrong. If this was layer 35, we were back in the early 1920 seconds. Maybe earlier. But the sheer violence of these marks. It suggested something inhuman, or someone who had become inhuman while trapped in this room. The smell was unbearable now. The copper tang was gone, replaced entirely by the sweet, cloying scent of wet rot. The wall was weeping. I looked at my hand. The gray dust I'd been scrubbing off was turning into a paste. The wall wasn't dry anymore. I was digging into something wet. By layer 38, the scraping sound had stopped. There was no more satisfying crunch of dry plaster or the tear of brittle paper. Instead, there was a wet, slapping sound. Splat. Splat. Squelch. The deeper I went, the less the wall felt like a part of a building, and the more it felt like I was dissecting something that had once been alive. I reached layer 40 around midnight on Saturday. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and trembling, but the wall wouldn't let me leave. It held me there with that sickening, sweet gravitational pull. The paper at this depth was unrecognizable. It wasn't patterned anymore. It was a sodden, gray pulp that disintegrated the moment the metal blade touched it. It came away in wet clumps, sliding down the wall like slurry, pooling on the floor in a black, viscous puddle. And the smell, God, the smell. It was no longer just rotting fruit. It was the smell of a drain that had been clogged with hair and meat for a century. It was thick and gaseous, making my eyes water and my throat constrict. I had tied a second t-shirt around my face, but it did nothing. The stench was absorbed into my pores. I cleared a patch about the size of a window in the center of the wall. Beneath the gray pulp of layer 40, the surface wasn't plaster. It wasn't brick. It was a stain. A massive, dark, spreading bruise covered the underlying material. It was black in the center, fading to a sickly purple, and then a jaundiced yellow at the edges. It looked exactly like a hematoma bad blood trapped under skin, and it was wet. A dark, oily liquid was weeping from the bruise, trickling down the wall in slow, black tears. I stared at it, mesmerized and repulsed. The help me messages were gone. There was no writing here. The people who had pasted these bottom layers hadn't had the time or the sanity to write. They had just covered it up. They had tried to smother it. I raised the scraper, intending to dig out the bruised section, to see what was bleeding. But as I brought the metal tip close to the wall, I saw it. Movement. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the flickering light or my sleep-deprived brain. I leaned in closer, until my nose was inches from the weeping black stain. Thump, thump. The wall moved. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't the building settling. The bruise bulged outward, then retracted. Thump, thump. It was a heartbeat. Slow, heavy, and wet. I could see the surface of the stain rippling with each beat, sending tiny shockwaves through the surrounding pulp. The wall was alive. It was pulsing with a biological rhythm, pumping that black fluid through invisible veins. I dropped the scraper. It landed with a dull splash in the muck on the floor. I should have run. I should have set fire to the building right then and there. But I reached out. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, moved toward the pulsing stain. I had to know. I had to feel it. My fingertips grazed the wet surface. It was warm, fever hot, and the moment I touched it, the pulsing stopped. The wall went rigid, tense. Then from the center of the bruise, a single air bubble rose to the surface of the black liquid and popped with a wet snap. It sounded like a gasp. I worked through the nausea. I worked through the terror. I worked through the feeling that the room was slowly tilting on its axis, sliding toward a precipice I couldn't see. Layers 41 through 46 didn't peel. They sloughed off like wet tissue paper. They were just a gray, gelatinous mush that coated my hands in hot, sticky filth. There were no messages on these layers. No help me. No warnings. Just the silence of total submission. The smell was hallucination-inducing, now thick, sweet, and coppery, filling my head with a buzzing static. Finally, my scraper hit something solid. Tunk. It wasn't the hollow sound of drywall. It was the dull, dense sound of heavy timber. I used my hands, my fingernails digging into the hot slime, to claw away the last remnants of layer 47. It fell away in a heavy wet sheet, landing on the pile of history at my feet. The wall was gone. In its place was a barrier of rough-hewn dark oak boards. They looked ancient, stained black by the fluids that had been seeping through them for decades. There were no nails visible. It looked like the side of a crate that had been sealed from the inside. And right in the center of the middle board, at exactly my eye level, was a knothole. It was about the size of a quarter. A perfect, jagged circle of darkness amidst the wet wood. I knew I shouldn't look. Every survival instinct I had left was screaming at me to run, to burn the building down, to never look back. But the compulsion that had driven me to strip 47 layers of paper wasn't done with me yet. The hole pulled at my gaze. It felt like the pupil of a larger eye, waiting for contact. I leaned forward. My breath hitched in my chest. I closed one eye and pressed the other to the rough, damp wood of the knothole. I expected to see the brick wall of the alleyway. I expected to see pipes, or insulation, or rats. I saw infinity. The space behind the wall wasn't a wall cavity. It was a vast, cavernous tunnel that stretched backward into a darkness that shouldn't exist. The physics were impossible. The alleyway was only 10 feet wide, but this tunnel went on for miles, twisting and turning like a catastrophic intestine. The walls of the tunnel were not made of brick. They were lined with paper, millions of layers of it, pulsing and shifting. And clinging to the walls of this impossible tunnel, like bats in a cave, were people. They were pale, emaciated, their skin slick with the black oil. Their limbs were elongated, joints twisted at wrong angles to grip the textured surface. I saw men in suits from the 20 seconds, women in housecoats from the 50 seconds, a kid in a Nirvana t-shirt. There were dozens of them, 47 of them. They weren't dead, they were working. They were huddled against the back of the wooden boards, their long, pale fingers scratching frantically at the wood, holding scraps of paper, writing on them with their own blood, with bile, with anything they could find. They were manufacturing the layers. They were building the wall thicker, layer by layer, from the inside. They weren't trying to get out. They were trying to keep something else from getting in. As I stared, paralyzed by the horror of it, The figure closest to the knothole stopped scratching. It was a man with long, matted gray hair. He slowly turned his head. His eyes were gone, replaced by smooth patches of skin. But he knew I was there. He opened his mouth, revealing a black, toothless void, and pressed his face against the other side of the knothole. "Run!" he wheezed. But he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the thing coming up the tunnel behind them. I didn't see the thing that was coming up the tunnel. I only heard it sound like a landslide of wet meat, a vast, chittering roar that shook the wooden boards against my forehead. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even put on my shoes. I ran out of apartment 304 inches, my socks, sliding on the slick black muck I had scraped from the wall. I scrambled down the 3 flights of stairs, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, and burst out into the freezing November night. I ran until my lungs burned and the soles of my feet were bleeding. I didn't stop until I was at a Greyhound station 5 miles away, shivering under fluorescent lights that felt too bright and too safe. That was 6 months ago. I'm writing this from a motel, 6 Inches, Arizona. I change locations every 3 days. I work cash-only jobs, dishwasher, day laborer, anything that keeps me off the grid. I don't rent apartments anymore. I don't stay in old buildings. I looked up the Galloway Arms online a week after I fled. There was a news story, a structural collapse on the 3rd floor. The report said the north wall of Unit 304 had caved in, causing a gas leak that condemned the whole building. They said the tenant me was missing. They found my laptop, my clothes, and my wallet, but they didn't find a body. And they didn't mention the tunnel. I've had a lot of time to think while staring at the textured ceilings of cheap motel rooms. I finally understand what I saw. I understand the layers. The help me messages weren't pleas for rescue. They weren't asking to be let out. They were begging me to stop. Those 47 people, they weren't victims of the wall. They were its guardians. They were the dam holding back a flood of something ancient and hungry. Every layer of wallpaper, every desperate scrawl, every inch of glue and paper was a reinforcement. They were thickening the barrier, sacrificing themselves to become the mortar that kept that tunnel sealed. And I, in my arrogance, in my boredom, I peeled it all away. I stripped the lock off the cage. I thought I had escaped. I thought putting 2,000 miles between me and that city would be enough. But last night, I woke up at 3:33 a.m. The motel room was silent. But then, from the wall behind the headboard, a cheap, thin sheet of drywall painted beige, I heard it. Scrawled. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of wet paper tearing. The sound of a sticker being peeled off raw meat. I turned on the lamp. The wall looked normal. But then I saw it. A tiny, damp spot forming right above the pillow. A smell of rotting peaches and old copper filled the small room. I'm not the explorer anymore. I'm not the victim. I'm the next layer. I have to go now. I have to find some paper. I have to find a pen. I have to warn the next one. If you move into a room and the walls feel soft, if the paper feels like skin, we don't touch it. For God's sake, help me keep it in.